All right, let's break down India's budget for 2026. And, this isn't just about a bunch of numbers, it's about a really high-stakes balancing act. It's about fueling some pretty explosive growth while also keeping the country's finances on solid ground. So, let's dive in.
So to really get what's happening with the budget, you got to look at the big picture first. Right now, the Indian economy is in what a lot of people are calling a Goldilocks period. Growth is really strong. The National Statistics Office is estimating a real GDP growth of a solid 7.4%, and at the same time, inflation has cooled down, which is a huge relief for everyone. It's that rare sweet spot of high growth and low inflation.
But there's a big question mark hanging over this pretty picture. Government debt is still really high, even higher than it was before the pandemic. So while the economic engine is running hot, is it burning through fuel it just doesn't have? Is this incredible performance built on a pile of borrowing that just isn't sustainable?
And to answer that, we need to wrap our heads around one key idea: the fiscal deficit. To put it simply, it's the shortfall between what the government makes and what it spends in a year. That gap, that's the amount the government has to go out and borrow. And honestly, managing this number is pretty much the central challenge of the entire budget.
So, what's the government's game plan? Well, it all comes down to a strategy called fiscal consolidation. Now, this isn't about slamming the brakes on spending. Think of it more as a careful, deliberate plan to get the country's finances onto a much more stable path.
Okay, so this plan really has three main parts. First, they're committed to slowly but surely shrinking that fiscal deficit. Second, and this is a big one, they're doubling down on something called capital expenditure. That's basically investing in long-term assets like roads and railways to power future growth. And third, they're looking to raise cash by selling off parts of government-owned companies, a process we call disinvestment.
All right, so that's the game plan. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty, the actual numbers for the 2026 budget. Okay, so take a look at this. The headline number here is the target for the fiscal deficit, 4.3% of GDP for the coming year. That's down just a tiny bit from 4.4%. Look, it's not some massive drop, right? But it does show they're sticking to that slow and steady path of getting their finances in order.
And here's where we see that second piece of the strategy in action. The government is pumping up its capital expenditure, its investment in building the country, to a whopping 12.2 trillion rupees. That's an 11.5% jump. The thinking here is pretty straightforward. Use government money to build things and make that the engine that drives the whole economy forward.
But then we get to the third piece of this puzzle, disinvestment. And wow, this slide really puts the challenge into perspective. The target for next year is a super ambitious 80,000 crore rupees. That's a 136% jump. But then look at how they've done so far this year. Just 8,800 crore. So you have to ask, with that kind of track record, is this new massive target even remotely realistic?
And that question leads us right into the more critical take on this budget. Because behind all the ambitious goals and the positive headlines, there are some pretty tough realities that analysts and rating agencies are pointing out. This quote from Moody's Ratings, it really nails the feeling a lot of experts have. Basically, they're saying, yeah, these are some smart, tactical moves to keep the ship steady, but it's not the game changer, not the big breakthrough they were hoping to see.
And this gets to a really crucial point. So the government did manage to hit its deficit target for the current year, but critics are asking some tough questions about how exactly they did it. And that brings up this whole idea of the quality of spending.
And when you dig into the data, you can see why people are a little worried. First off, tax revenues came in way short of the estimate by over 1.6 lakh crore. So to make up that difference and still hit the deficit target, they had to cut spending, especially on things like grants to states for building assets. Add that to the fact that they've been missing their disinvestment targets for years and that more and more money is just going to pay interest on debt. Well, you start to see a picture that's a lot more complicated.
Okay, to really get what's at stake here, we need to zoom out for a second, away from the annual numbers, and look at the government's grand, long-term ambition for the whole country.
And that's where this idea of Viksit Bharat comes in. It's this huge national vision for a developed India. The goal is to transform India into a high-income economy by 2047, which is the 100th anniversary of its independence. It's a massive goal, right? It's about becoming an economic powerhouse, but also making sure everyone comes along for the ride. But look, getting there, it's a monumental task. The math shows that to pull this off, India needs to grow at a steady 7 to 8%, not just for a year or two, but every single year.
And you just can't have that kind of explosive long-term growth unless your financial foundation is rock solid. So the disciplined choices made in today's budget are literally the building blocks for tomorrow's big ambitions.
And that brings us right back to where we started. We've seen that this budget is a very careful, tactical balancing act. But here's the billion-dollar, or maybe trillion-dollar question. Is that steady-as-she-goes approach really enough to spark the kind of breakthrough India needs to hit its incredible 2047 goal? That's the big question this budget really leaves us thinking about.